where we explore the most substantive issues arising from the source material through thoughtful, respectful disagreement. Today, we're looking at, a really transformative idea presented in our reading.
It is. The idea is that for advanced English learners, we're talking C1 level, writing isn't just about getting thoughts down on paper, it's actually the most effective way to achieve real mental clarity. The material frames it as a cognitive workout.
Exactly. A workout that forces structure and exposes the gaps in your logic. But the core question for us today is about the mechanism. What's actually causing that clarity? Is it, as I'll argue, the cognitive friction that comes from the very act of writing in a second language? Or is it something else?
And that's where I come in. I'm going to argue that while writing is, of course, a useful tool, the real source of clarity comes from applying formal, structural thinking techniques, things like mapping or simplification, which are, in a way, independent of the medium itself. The clarity is structural, not necessarily linguistic.
Okay. I see why you think that. But let me offer a different perspective, one that really focuses on that L2 friction. My core thesis is that the very difficulty, the forced deceleration of writing in a second language, is the key engine of clarity. The material points out that the mind's speed is actually a curse for clarity.
A curse for clarity?
Right. It operates like this chaotic, associative stream of consciousness. An idea can feel brilliant inside your head, but that feeling is often just an illusion, a shortcut that avoids the hard work of building a logical sequence. The act of writing forces a radical deceleration. It makes you translate that chaotic cloud of related concepts into a linear logical sequence.
Mm-hmm.
And this gets to the principle of productive constraint. For a C1 learner, your English vocabulary is huge, but it's still smaller than your native tongues. And that limitation is actually a formidable asset. It takes away the crutch of those vague native phrases or idioms that let fuzzy thinking slide. It forces you to build meaning from the ground up.
So you're suggesting that the pressure to pick just one precise word in English is actually the moment clarity happens?
It is, absolutely. I mean, think about it. In your native language, you might use some vague, high-level term that just means important. But when you have to put that into C1 English, you're suddenly forced to choose. Is it important, critical, influential, or urgent? That choice makes you stop and ask, well, what kind of importance am I really talking about? Is it about time? Is it foundational? The need to choose a word from a more limited set eliminates ambiguity. That's how it breeds clarity.
I come at it from a different perspective. I'm just not convinced that the act of writing itself, or even the L2 constraint, is the primary mechanism. To me, the true clarity is achieved by using specific, formal structural techniques that just so happen to be performed through writing. Take the Feynman technique that the material brings up.
Okay.
It's a powerful conceptual framework, right? Explain an idea simply, as if to a child, find the gaps in your knowledge, and then refine it. That technique imposes clarity whether you do it in English, Mandarin, or just by drawing pictures on a whiteboard. The writing is just the container.
But the writing is what gives you that durable external artifact to critique. You can see the gaps.
Not necessarily in linear prose, though, and this is a key piece of evidence. Look at Lars, the Swedish PhD student, who was just drowning in his 300-page thesis. His breakthrough came when he stopped trying to write sentences and started drawing the logical structure using argument mapping. He spent weeks just making boxes, lines, and arrows. This shows that the key intellectual exercise was visual and nonlinear. The clarity came from building that architecture, not from composing prose. The map became what he called the detailed blueprint, and only then did the words flow easily. The heavy lifting was done before a single paragraph was written.
I see that, and that's a very compelling point about visual structure, I'll grant you. But it doesn't really account for the L2 friction. I mean, if you argue that the most efficient path is just using a structural technique in your native language, you're ignoring the real psychological hurdles L2 writers face. Think about Kenji, the accountant mentioned in the text. He was paralyzed by anxiety over his English reports. He'd have perfectly clear thoughts in his L1, but the stress of translating them made him doubt the original concept itself.
I agree that anxiety is a huge hurdle, but that's precisely the problem with your thesis. The L2 constraint can add this emotional burden that just overwhelms the whole cognitive process. If clarity is the goal, then the most efficient method has to be applying the structural technique in the language where you have the most conceptual fluency, your L1. Then you just translate the already clarified structure. Why add a linguistic burden if you can perfect the architecture without it? Making the process harder doesn't automatically make the result clearer. It just makes it slower.
I'm going to push back on that idea of most efficient, because the goal here isn't just efficiency, it's true cognitive transformation. The L2 constraint is a unique strength, because in our native tongue, fluency can, and often does, mask fuzzy thinking. We get comfortable with our idioms and fillers that hide weak logic, but the C1 learner, like Sophia using her morning pages, finds her authentic voice only when she's stripped of those ingrained habits and forced to build meaning deliberately, brick by brick, in English. That deliberate effort is the clarity. The friction makes sure you can't cheat.
I respect that, I do, but the core insight, choosing a precise word, is still a conceptual task. If I define a term rigorously in a concept map, or use the Feynman technique to boil an idea down to its core, that clarity is achieved before I even think about a specific English word. The L2 constraint might force the choice sooner, sure, but the anxiety or paralysis that Kenji and Lars felt can actually get in the way of the primary task, which is structuring the argument in the first place.
I'm just not sure I buy that, because it minimizes the benefit of seeing the thought in its final linguistic form. Writing gives you this critical cognitive scaffolding by making the thought a tangible object. And once it's on the page, in English, it has a fixed, stable form. That allows for things that are impossible in your head, like large-scale restructuring, literally cutting and pasting whole arguments, and instantly seeing logical gaps that your mind just skips over.
Let's stick with that term, cognitive scaffolding. I agree, externalization is key, but I just don't believe that scaffolding has to be linear prose. I'm sorry, but that doesn't hold up. The source material itself shows that argument mapping with its boxes and arrows is incredibly effective for building the logical skeleton, and it's specifically noted for separating the challenge of structuring an argument from the challenge of phrasing it in perfect English.
But there's a unique feedback that text provides. When you write, "I argue our company should invest in AI, it will improve efficiency," the linearity of the prose immediately screams that there's a huge logical gap between your premise and your conclusion. A diagram might show the components, but the forced sequence of an argument in text compels you to build that bridge. A map can be static, prose is dynamic, it's persuasive.
That's an interesting distinction, but I think the case of Lars really refutes that. His visual map was the detailed blueprint that let him see those gaps, the ones he couldn't spot after weeks of drafting sentences. The map gave him the conceptual equivalent of cut and paste. It confirms that structure and visual externalization are the drivers. The prose is just the final coat of paint. The clarity was in effect pre-written by the structural technique, which separated the what from the how.
Well, I understand the appeal of mapping as prep work, but what about the private work of writing? I'm thinking of Technique 4, purpose-driven journaling, where you're just clarifying decisions for yourself. That's where the real integration happens. It builds the mental models you need when the stakes are high. Priya's success wasn't just about streamlining a report. Her confidence came from the private practice of simplifying her project for her non-tech uncle using the Feynman technique before she ever wrote the official memo.
But that's a case for the technique, not the L2 medium itself.
I'd frame it differently. That private, messy, low-stakes practice in English is what prepared her for public confidence. If Priya had only simplified the idea for her uncle in her native language, she'd still have to face the anxiety of translating that simplified concept into clear, professional English under pressure. Wrestling with the simplification in the L2 builds a kind of mental resilience that planning in your L1 just can't replicate.
That's a fair point about psychological preparedness, but it still assigns the cognitive clarity to the medium instead of the method. Priya's success came from mastering the Feynman technique, the principle of simplification. That method is universal. Applying it in English is great language practice, sure, but the hero of the story is the deliberate act of simplifying the idea, not the linguistic vehicle it's delivered in.
And I believe that the necessity of overcoming that linguistic friction provides a deeper, more enduring form of cognitive restructuring. It cements the clarity in a way a structural outline alone just can't. In closing, I'd say the journey from a messy internal thought to a stable form of text really does require the unique discipline imposed by composing in a second language, the need to choose precise words, to intentionally build structure with a constrained vocabulary. It all creates a cognitive friction that transforms vague concepts into clear, articulate ideas. Writing in English is the private lab where true mental mastery is achieved.
I respect that emphasis on the power of the medium. But for me, the material demonstrates that clarity is fundamentally achieved through the rigorous application of these deliberate formal techniques: simplification, structured mapping, gap identification. These are the tools that impose logical order. While L2 writing is an invaluable tool for language practice and confidence, I maintain that the foundational architecture for cognitive clarity resides in the universal technique, not the linguistic medium itself.
We've definitely identified the core tension here between the linguistic constraint on one hand and the conceptual technique on the other as the main driver of clarity.
Indeed. And regardless of which factor you believe is primary, the insights here underscore the profound value of using structured practice. Whether it's through the rigor of morning pages in English, the visual architecture of argument mapping, or the Feynman technique, the path to clearer thinking lies in deliberate externalization. The material offers some truly robust methods for deeper exploration.